Montana Territory, November 1887. The thermometer nailed to the cabin's exterior post read 8 degrees below zero, and Adelaide Thornwell knew without checking that the interior temperature had already dropped beneath freezing, despite the hearth fire she'd fed 3 times since midnight. Frost patterns spread across the inside of the log walls like invasive lace, beautiful and deadly. The iron nails driven into the chinking had developed their own coats of ice, each one a tiny monument to the losing battle she'd been fighting since her husband's death 2 winters past. She pressed her palm against the bedroom door. The wood felt like stone pulled from a creek bed in January. Behind it, her daughters slept or tried to under every quilt and blanket the household owned. 8-year-old Beatrice had developed that cough again, the wet, rattling sound that had started last November and never fully left her lungs. Each barking fit sent terror through Adelaide's chest, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Her older sister had died of pneumonia at age 9. Adelaide still remembered the sound. The hearth in the main room drew her back, its heat barely radiating 3 feet before dissipating into the cabin's relentless cold. She'd burned through 18 logs since supper. At this rate, the woodpile she and Rosalind had spent October splitting would be gone by New Year. What then? The aspens wouldn't burn hot enough. The cottonwoods along the creek were green. Every homestead within 10 miles faced the same mathematics of survival, the same brutal equation where winter always came out ahead. Through the oiled paper window, dawn arrived gray and grudging. Adelaide pulled her shawl tighter and stepped outside to feed the livestock. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath, making her eyes water instantly. 20 paces to the barn. She counted each one. Inside, the change was immediate and undeniable. Still cold, but perceptibly less brutal. Her breath still clouded, but the air didn't knife into her lungs with quite the same violence. The 2 milk cows shifted in their stalls, their massive bodies radiating warmth into the confined space. The mule stood with its head lowered, dozing. Above in the loft, the chickens murmured and rustled. Adelaide stood motionless, letting her body register what her mind had been too exhausted to notice. The animals slept warmer than her children. The thought arrived without drama, a simple observation that felt both wrong and irrefutable. She pulled off one glove, held her bare hand in the air. 40 degrees, maybe. 42. The dirt floor beneath her boots didn't conduct cold the way the cabin's plank flooring did. The barn's walls, rough and unfinished, somehow held what the cabin's chinked logs couldn't. She thought of Joseph dead 26 months from typhoid fever, thought of his hands teaching Rosalind to measure twice and cut once, to trust the level more than the eye. Thought of the last coherent thing he'd said before the fever took his mind: "The earth is warmer than the air." Addie always has been. She'd assumed delirium. Now, standing in a barn that logic said should be uninhabitable but somehow wasn't, she wondered if he'd been trying to tell her something essential. The revelation didn't arrive as lightning. It accumulated like snow on a roof-weight building until the structure beneath had to acknowledge it or collapse. She couldn't make the air warmer. She couldn't make the cabin hold heat it wasn't designed to hold. But she could go where the warmth already existed, buried in principles so obvious that no one with formal training would bother to mention them, because everyone already knew: heat rises, stone holds, earth insulates. Except no one was using that knowledge. They were all freezing in their cabins, burning through wood they couldn't replace, telling themselves that suffering was simply what winter demanded. Adelaide fed the animals and went back inside. Rosalind was up tending to Beatrice, who'd woken coughing so hard she'd vomited. The 12-year-old looked at her mother with eyes that carried too much understanding, too much responsibility for someone still 2 years from confirmation. "She needs to see Doc Brennan." Adelaide nodded, knowing and not saying that Constance Whitmore's husband controlled Brennan's practice, controlled most things in the valley that involved money or influence. And Constance had made it abundantly clear what she thought of widows attempting to homestead alone. The previous Sunday, standing in the churchyard while snow fell and everyone pretended not to listen, Constance's voice had carried with perfect clarity. "Those girls need proper care, Adelaide. You can't give them what they need. There are institutions, families, people equipped to raise children without improvisation. The word improvisation had landed like a slap, as though Adelaide's survival, her daughter's survival, was some kind of theatrical performance rather than a daily negotiation with physics and probability and the relentless hostility of Montana winter. She cleaned Beatrice up, made thin porridge that used the last of the oats, and sat with both girls as they ate. The cabin's main room never climbed above 40 degrees despite the fire. Beatrice's lips had a blue tinge. Rosalind's hands shook from cold, even wrapped around her bowl. "Mama," Beatrice's voice came small and frightened, "I don't want to go away." Adelaide's throat tightened. So the talk had reached even the children. Constance's campaign wasn't subtle. The woman had money position, the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether next month would bring starvation or merely deprivation. She probably thought she was being charitable, rescuing 2 girls from a mother too foolish or too stubborn to admit defeat. "You're not going anywhere." Adelaide kept her voice level, certain. "This is your home." But homes required heat, and heat required either fuel they didn't have or solutions that didn't yet exist. She looked at her daughters. Rosalind already trying to be the adult she shouldn't have to become. Beatrice struggling to breathe through lungs inflamed by months of sleeping in temperatures that routinely dropped below freezing and felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. That night, after the girls had finally fallen into fitful sleep, Adelaide sat at the table with Joseph's carpentry journal open before her. He'd kept meticulous notes on every project, sketches and measurements and observations about wood grain load bearing the way moisture moved through structures. She'd never paid much attention before, but now she turned pages with desperate focus looking for something, anything that might confirm or refute the idea taking shape in her mind. Near the back, dated April 1884, she found it. A sketch of a root cellar, notes about temperature stability observations, about how the earth 12 feet down stayed remarkably consistent year-round. 50 degrees, Joseph had written. Winter, summer doesn't matter. Earth that deep doesn't know seasons. Her hand trembled as she traced the words. He'd known. Maybe not the specific application, but the principle. The earth held steady while the air swung wild. Stone absorbed heat and released it slowly. If she could position herself below the rising heat, let gravity do the work that fuel couldn't use the animal's own metabolism as an engine. The physics were almost embarrassingly simple, which meant either she was missing something fundamental or everyone else was. She stayed up until the hearth fire died to embers, sketching possibilities in the margins of Joseph's journal. A room beneath the barn floor. 8 feet down, deep enough to escape the frost line, shallow enough to excavate without equipment. Stone walls for thermal mass. Timber ceiling to support the barn's weight above. Ventilation through the existing structure. A small stove just enough to nudge the temperature up during the coldest hours, with the earth and stone doing the rest of the work. It would take months. She'd have to dig in secret or face the valley's judgment before she had results to silence it. She'd need help with the heavy timber, the technical aspects she didn't fully understand. But it was possible. Not easy, not simple, but possible, in a way that surviving another winter in this cabin was not. February gave way to March. The ground began to thaw, turning to mud, before firming up enough to work. Adelaide waited for the first morning when her shovel could penetrate more than 3 inches without hitting frozen earth, then began. She told no one. Not the girls who still slept in the cabin's icy bedroom. Not the neighbors who would have opinions and objections and well-meaning interference. She worked between 2 and 5 in the morning when the valley slept and darkness covered her labor. The barn's northwest corner, where the mule's stall provided both cover and excuse for rearrangement. She removed the dirt in feed sacks, distributed it in places that wouldn't draw attention, filling ruts in the path, building up the area around the well. The first week she gained 8 inches of depth. The second week another foot. Her back screamed. Her hands bled despite gloves. She woke at noon and tried to pretend she'd simply slept poorly, but Rosalind noticed the dirt under her fingernails, the new calluses, the way Adelaide moved like someone twice her age. "What are you building?" Adelaide looked at her daughter across the breakfast table and made a decision. Secrets wouldn't survive the reality of what she was attempting. Better to make Rosalind an ally than a witness. A bedroom, for the three of us, under the barn. Rosalind's face cycled through confusion, shock, and something that might have been hope before settling on cautious skepticism. Under the barn, 8 feet down, where the earth stays warm. People will say, people are already saying I can't care for you properly. I'd rather prove them wrong than argue about it. The girl considered this, nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? From that point forward they worked in shifts. Adelaide took the pre-dawn hours, Rosalind the afternoon when Beatrice napped. The excavation deepened, 4 feet, 6. At 7.5 feet, Adelaide hit bedrock ancient stone that her shovel couldn't chip, that rang like iron when struck. Close enough to 8. She'd build from there. April brought Silas Merrick into the plan, though not by Adelaide's choice. The 68-year-old carpenter had been Joseph's teacher back when Joseph was still learning the trade, and he showed up one afternoon ostensibly to check on the widow Thornwell, actually to investigate the sounds of construction he'd heard while passing at dawn. He found Adelaide in the barn measuring timber salvaged from an abandoned claim 5 miles north. The hole in the floor, wider now, obviously intentional, couldn't be explained as anything but what it was. Silas stood at the edge, looking down into the excavation, his weathered face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried neither approval nor condemnation, just a carpenter's assessment of structure. You're going to need help with the ceiling. Those beams can't rest on earth. They need to transfer load to bedrock or you'll have collapse within a year. Adelaide waited for the lecture, the warnings, the inevitable attempt to talk her out of insanity. Instead, Silas walked to the timber pile, selected an 8-inch beam, and tested its weight. Joseph would have done the same thing. Probably smarter to do it while alive than have someone find your frozen bodies come spring. Relief nearly buckled her knees. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. He examined the excavation's dimensions, nodded slowly. 10 by 12. Good size. You've already got past the frost line. Smart. How are you planning to handle the walls? Limestone, from the creek bed. Load-bearing or just facing? The question revealed gaps in Adelaide's knowledge she hadn't known existed. Silas spent the next hour explaining, not lecturing, explaining about thermal mass, about how stone could absorb heat during active burning and release it across 10 or 12 hours, about the difference between aesthetic choices and structural necessities. By sunset they had a revised plan. Full limestone walls 18 inches thick, dry stacked and mud mortared. Ceiling beams notched directly into bedrock, where possible into stone, where not, creating a framework that treated the surrounding earth as container rather than foundation. The barn floor above would remain intact except for a trap door in the northwest corner, hidden beneath what would appear to be a feed storage area. When people find out, Adelaide began. Let them talk. Talking's free. Heat costs wood. Silas picked up his tools. I'll be here at dawn. We've got 6 weeks before this needs to be functional, unless you want to spend another winter like the last one. He left before she could thank him, which was probably intentional. Some men offered help best when it looked like mutual self-interest rather than charity. The work intensified. Adelaide and Silas hauled limestone from the creek bed, 200 individual stones, each one split and shaped by hand. Rosalind took over all the household duties Adelaide had been neglecting, keeping Beatrice fed and occupied, while her mother transformed herself into something between miner and mason. The walls rose course by course, thick enough to store meaningful heat, tight enough to keep the underground space dry. By late April, Daniel Wright stopped by. He'd heard rumors impossible to hide, the amount of stone being moved, the timber being shaped, the concentrated activity around the Thornwell barn. He was the valley's master carpenter, trained in Philadelphia, possessor of actual engineering knowledge rather than frontier improvisation. His opinion would carry weight, and Adelaide knew before he opened his mouth that it wouldn't favor her project. He inspected the work with professional thoroughness, noting the ceiling structure, the ventilation plan, the small cast-iron stove Adelaide had scavenged from a burned-out claim cabin. When he climbed back up the ladder, his expression combined skepticism with genuine concern. Mrs. Thornwell, I've seen men with formal training attempt structures like this. The risks are substantial. Ventilation failure leads to carbon monoxide poisoning. Settling under load can cause catastrophic collapse. I understand your desperation, but this is not the solution. Adelaide met his eyes without flinching. What is the solution? Burn wood I don't have. Watch my daughter develop tuberculosis from sleeping in a cabin that never gets above freezing. Send my children away to prove I can properly care for them. There are established methods. That don't work. You've seen the cabins, Mr. Wright. You know how much fuel it takes to keep them habitable. I don't have that fuel. I do have earthstone and a space where heat naturally accumulates. If the physics are wrong, explain where. Wright hesitated. She'd trapped him in his own expertise. The physics weren't wrong, just unconventional. Heat did rise. Stone did hold thermal mass. Earth did provide insulation. The problem wasn't the principle, it was the execution and criticizing that meant identifying specific failures he couldn't actually point to. I hope for your daughter's sake that I'm wrong. He said it without rancor, genuine worry in his voice. But I've seen winter kill people who thought they'd outsmarted it. After he left, Silas spat tobacco juice and kept working. Man's not wrong about the risks. He's just wrong about whether the risks are worse than the alternative. May brought completion. The limestone walls stood solid 18 inches of stone that would absorb heat from the small stove and radiate it back long after the fire died. The ceiling 8-inch beams notched into bedrock covered with tight-fitted planks and 6 inches of packed clay could support a loaded hay wagon without flexing. The trapdoor disguised beneath feed sacks opened onto a ladder that descended into a space that already felt warmer than it should, insulated by earth on 3 sides and agricultural heat from above. The stove installation took 2 days. Running the pipe horizontally through the stone wall up the barn's exterior, merging it with the existing barn chimney. So from a distance everything looked ordinary, unremarkable, exactly like every other homestead structure in the valley. Adelaide tested the draft a dozen times, obsessively checking for backflow or blockage. Carbon monoxide was odorless, tasteless, and fatal. Wright's warning had lodged in her mind like a splinter. Ventilation required multiple pathways, primary, secondary, and emergency. A 4-inch shaft through the barn floor disguised as a structural post. A gap between ceiling planks and wall stones allowing passive air circulation. The stovepipe itself, which would draw fresh air even when the fire was cold. Adelaide tested each one, lit smoke bombs to watch the patterns verified flow under different wind conditions. By early June, the space was technically complete. 10 feet by 12, 8 feet deep stone walls that rang solid when struck, a dirt floor packed hard as concrete, and a ceiling that supported the weight of the barn above without visible stress. It smelled of earth and livestock and fresh clay. It stayed remarkably dry despite being below grade. And when Adelaide descended the ladder and simply stood there, she felt the temperature difference. Not warm, but warmer. 50 degrees without any fire, just the passive insulation of earth and the metabolic heat filtering down from the animals above. She moved 2 simple bed frames down in July when the work could be explained as storage. Built a small shelf for the oil lamp, brought down 3 quilts and tested whether moisture would be an issue. The earth walls breathed just enough to prevent condensation, but not enough to create drafts. The chickens in the loft clucked and scratched their small bodies, contributing warmth that accumulated rather than dissipated. Summer passed. Adelaide and Rosalind harvested what garden they'd managed between construction work, preserved what they could, prepared for the test that would come when temperature dropped and philosophy met reality. Beatrice's cough had improved during the warmer months, but Adelaide knew what September would bring. The choice looming over her wasn't whether to use the underground room, but whether it would work well enough to justify the risk. The valley noticed the Thornwell barn's modifications impossible not to, given the amount of material moved, but most assumed Adelaide was adding storage or rearranging for efficiency. A few asked outright. Adelaide's responses stayed vague. Preparing for winter, making improvements, working on a project Joseph had started. All technically true, none revealing enough to trigger organized opposition. Constance Whitmore noticed most of all. The wealthy matron made a point of stopping by in September, ostensibly to discuss a church charity drive, actually to investigate rumors that Adelaide was doing something both desperate and undignified. "I hear you've been making substantial changes to your husband's barn." Adelaide continued folding laundry. "Some. People are concerned, Adelaide, about your judgment, about whether you're thinking clearly. People are welcome to their concerns." Constance's expression hardened. She was used to deference, to the automatic respect that money and position commanded. Adelaide's calm indifference clearly rankled. "This isn't about pride. Your daughters deserve stability, proper guidance. The church can arrange placement with families equipped to— My daughters are staying with me." "In a barn!" Constance's voice rose slightly, losing its veneer of gentle concern. "Is that what you're planning, to have them sleep with livestock like animals? How is that proper care?" Adelaide met her eyes, saw the genuine conviction there. Constance actually believed she was helping, that removing children from an incompetent mother was mercy rather than cruelty. Some part of Adelaide understood. To someone who'd never faced the choice between dignity and survival, the two probably seemed impossible to separate. "My daughters will be warm this winter, healthy, safe. That's proper care." Constance stood, smoothed her expensive skirts. "I'll be speaking to Reverend Morrison. The church has a responsibility to intervene when children are at risk." After she left, Rosalind emerged from the bedroom where she'd been listening. "Will she really try to take us?" "She'll try, won't succeed." Adelaide hoped the certainty in her voice sounded more genuine than it felt. Constance had influence, money, social position. Adelaide had a hole in the ground and a theory about thermodynamics. If the room failed, if the physics she'd built everything on proved insufficient, Constance's intervention wouldn't be cruel, just inevitable. November arrived with early cold. The first hard freeze came October 28th, 2 weeks ahead of normal. Adelaide lit a test fire in the underground stove, watched smoke rise clean through the chimney, felt the limestone walls begin to warm. Rosalind brought Beatrice down the ladder to see. The 8-year-old stood in the center of the space, looking around with wide eyes. "We're sleeping here, starting tonight. It's not a real bedroom. It's warm, that's real enough." They moved their beds down that evening, November 8th, 1887. Adelaide lit 6 logs in the small stove, a fraction of what the cabin hearth required. The temperature climbed steadily, 52 degrees to start 56, within an hour, 58 by bedtime. The limestone absorbed heat, the earth held it, the barn floor above blocked wind. Physics did what physics did. Beatrice slept through the night without coughing. First time since the previous March. Adelaide woke once, instinctively checking ventilation temperature, the girl's breathing. Everything stable. The stove had died to embers, but the stone walls radiated retained heat. The room was 54 degrees with no active fire. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 18 below. Morning brought Rosalind's quiet observation, "We used 6 logs." Adelaide nodded. In the cabin that would have lasted maybe 3 hours of marginal comfort, here it had kept them genuinely warm for 12. The mathematics of survival had just fundamentally shifted. But mathematics convinced no one except mathematicians. The valley's reaction came swift and harsh. Word spread that Adelaide Thornwell had moved her daughters into a hole beneath the barn, sleeping with livestock, abandoning even the pretense of civilized living. Constance's campaign found fresh ammunition. The widow had finally cracked under pressure, lost her grip on reality, dragged her children down into literal dirt and darkness. Reverend Morrison visited on November 15th, his face grave with pastoral concern. He asked to see the space. Adelaide showed him, watched him descend the ladder and stand in a room that was indisputably 57 degrees despite outdoor temperatures below zero. He touched the stone walls, examined the ventilation, noted the girls' beds made neatly with only 2 blankets each. "Mrs. Thornwell, I understand your innovation here, but the congregation has concerns about propriety, about the message this sends regarding a woman's proper role and standards of living. The message is that my children are warm and healthy. I'll defend that to anyone." Morrison sighed, not unkindly. "I'm not your enemy, Adelaide. But Constance has convinced the church council that intervention may be necessary. They're prepared to petition for guardianship evaluation, for the girl's welfare. Adelaide's stomach went cold, but she kept her voice level. On what grounds? Neglect, providing inadequate shelter, subjecting children to conditions unfit for habitation. He gestured around the underground room. You must see how this looks to people unfamiliar with your methods. It looks like my daughter's sleeping in 58-degree warmth instead of freezing in a cabin I can't afford to heat. Anyone who thinks that's neglect is welcome to spend a night in each and compare. The Reverend left without committing to either support or opposition, which Adelaide recognized as the political non-answer it was. The church would wait to see which way community sentiment fell before deciding whether to bless or condemn her choice. November became December. Adelaide burned 8 to 10 logs daily, maintaining temperatures between 55 and 60 degrees. The limestone walls proved even more effective than projected, holding heat for 12 to 14 hours after the fire died. Beatrice's cough disappeared entirely. Rosalind had color in her cheeks for the first time in months. The underground space stayed dry, warm, and despite initial fears, remarkably comfortable. Meanwhile, the valley froze. Cabins became ice boxes that devoured fuel and returned minimal heat. Families burned 30, 40, 50 logs a day and still woke to frost on their bedroom walls. Children shivered under 5 blankets. Adults fed fires every 2 hours through the night and still couldn't keep temperatures above 40 degrees. And Adelaide Thornwell's woodpile barely diminished. Thomas Fletcher noticed first. He'd been watching with the kind of grim curiosity reserved for watching someone walk toward a cliff, waiting for the inevitable fall. But December passed, then Christmas, and Adelaide kept appearing at church, looking rested rather than exhausted, her daughters healthy rather than consumptive. Her woodpile, which should have been half gone by New Year, remained nearly full. The mathematics didn't work unless her heating method was impossibly efficient, which meant either she'd found something everyone else had missed or she was lying about using the underground room and secretly burning wood elsewhere. Fletcher wasn't sure which possibility disturbed him more. January arrived with warnings. Old-timers read the signs, animals acting strange, pressure dropping that particular quality to the light that preceded serious weather. Adelaide felt it too, a tension in the air like the pause before lightning. She stockpiled 3 days' worth of logs in the underground room, made sure all 3 ventilation pathways were clear, and waited. The storm hit January 11, 1888. Temperature plummeted to 31 below zero in 3 hours. Wind came from the northwest at 45 miles per hour, gusting higher. Snow fell horizontal, so thick the barn disappeared from view even standing at the cabin door. Adelaide gathered her daughters, descended the ladder, and pulled the trapdoor closed above them, sealing themselves into earth and stone while the surface world turned lethal. She lit 6 logs. The stove radiated heat into limestone walls that absorbed and held it. The temperature climbed to 56 degrees and stayed there. Above them, wind screamed through barn boards. Below, in their bubble of engineered warmth, Adelaide read to her daughters from a book of frontier poetry. Her voice steady, their breathing easy. The storm lasted 72 hours. 3 days of nature demonstrating exactly how little it cared about human survival, how quickly civilization's veneer cracked when temperature and wind allied against it. On the surface, families fought desperate battles. Chimneys backdrafted, forcing choices between smoke inhalation and freezing. Woodpiles melted like snow in August. People burned furniture, fence posts, anything combustible. Thomas Fletcher's family burned 42 logs the first day, 48 the second, 51 the third. Their cabin never got above 38 degrees. His youngest son developed frostbite on 2 fingers despite being indoors the entire time. His wife Mary tended the fire every 45 minutes around the clock and still couldn't prevent ice from forming on the inside walls. Constance Whitmore's household burned through their entire January allocation by the second evening. They started on February's pile, then began feeding the hearth with kitchen furniture. By the third morning, they'd consumed the dining table and were eyeing the chairs. Their cabin held at 35 degrees, cold enough that breath-clouded bedding felt damp. Children cried from cold that no amount of blankets could defeat. Adelaide used 10 logs on day 112, on day 210, again on day 3. 32 logs total across 72 hours of the worst winter weather Montana could deliver. The underground room never dropped below 52 degrees. Never. The earth didn't care about wind. The stone didn't recognize storms. Physics operated with complete indifference to meteorological drama. When the storm finally broke on the morning of January 14th, Adelaide emerged into a valley transformed. Snow drifted 5 feet deep against the barn's north wall. The thermometer read -18. Every structure wore white. Every chimney pumped desperate smoke into air so cold it seemed to freeze the plumes mid-rise. And Thomas Fletcher stood at her barn door, eyes tracking from her relatively untouched woodpile to the thin smoke trail from the barn chimney to Adelaide herself, looking rested in a way that should have been impossible after 3 days of winter siege. His voice came hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "How many logs did you burn?" Adelaide considered lying, decided against it. The truth would come out eventually. Better to control its release. 32. Over 3 days. Fletcher's face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and something approaching desperation. His family had burned 141. The mathematics were obscene, impossible, undeniable. "I need to see it." Not a request, a plea. "Whatever you've done, I need to understand how you survived this." Adelaide led him to the trap door, moved the feed sacks aside, opened the passage to the space below. Warm air rose immediately, 58 degrees meeting 18 below, creating visible distortion in the frigid morning air. Fletcher descended the ladder like a man entering a shrine. He stood in the center of the room, pulled a thermometer from his coat pocket habit from checking livestock conditions, and held it steady. 58 degrees. The stove was cold, hadn't been lit since 10 o'clock the previous evening. 14 hours ago. The temperature outside was -18. The difference was 76 degrees maintained by stone and earth, and principles so fundamental that no one had thought to weaponize them against winter. Fletcher touched the limestone walls, still faintly warm, examined the ventilation shafts, noted the beds with their minimal blankets, looked at Adelaide with an expression she'd never seen directed at her before, respect mixed with something close to awe. 32 logs. He said it like he still couldn't quite believe it. "My family burned 141, and we were colder than this the entire time. Heat rises, stone holds, earth insulates." Adelaide kept her voice neutral, factual. "I didn't invent anything, just paid attention to how it actually works." Fletcher shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Thornwell, I owe you an apology. I thought we all thought you'd lost your mind. We were waiting for the failure. I was too busy staying warm to worry about opinions." He laughed, a short bark of exhausted amusement. "My wife asked me to ask, would you mind if others came to see this? People are going to have questions. A lot of questions." Adelaide considered the request and its implications. Opening the space to inspection meant opening herself to judgment, criticism, the endless opinions of people who'd contributed nothing but skepticism. But it also meant the possibility of others surviving winters they might not otherwise endure, of children sleeping warm instead of cold, of families not burning themselves into poverty every December through March. "Tell them the truth is available to anyone willing to look at it." Fletcher nodded and climbed back up the ladder, emerged into Montana winter, and walked away carrying information that would change the valley's relationship with cold in ways neither of them yet fully understood. Adelaide stood alone in the underground room, feeling the stone walls still radiating heat, listening to the absolute silence that earth provided, and let herself acknowledge what the last 3 days had proven beyond any possible argument. She'd been right. Not lucky, not foolish, not desperate. Right. The physics worked exactly as physics always worked. Indifferent to convention, unimpressed by tradition, reliable as mathematics. Above her, the valley was still digging out from the storm, still counting losses, still shivering in cabins that would never be warm enough no matter how much wood they burned. Below her, in a space that had cost 3 months of brutal labor and the price of being called crazy, Her daughters slept healthy and warm because their mother had refused to accept that freezing was simply what winter demanded. That refusal Adelaide thought might be the most valuable thing she'd ever build. Thomas Fletcher walked home through snow that came up past his knees, carrying knowledge that weighed more than the physical exhaustion dragging at his limbs. His wife Mary met him at the door, face gray from 3 days of smoke and terror, children huddled behind her, still wrapped in every piece of fabric the household owned. "Did you find out how she survived?" He nodded, unable to find words adequate to the gap between what he'd expected and what he'd seen. Finally, she built a room under her barn, 8 feet down, limestone walls. The temperature down there is 58 degrees right now, hasn't had a fire in 14 hours, and she burned 32 logs total for the entire storm. Mary's face went through the same progression his had: disbelief, calculation, slow comprehension. 32. The room's maybe a third the size of our main room, but the earth keeps it warm. The stone holds the heat. It just works. His youngest son spoke from behind Mary's skirts. "Can we have a room like that?" Fletcher met his wife's eyes and saw the same desperate hope he felt. They'd survived the storm, but barely. February still loomed. March could be worse. The wood situation had gone from concerning to catastrophic. Unless they found a different answer, they'd be burning bed frames before Valentine's Day. "I'm going to ask if she'll show others. Tomorrow." But he didn't need to ask. By the time he returned to the Thornwell property the next morning, 2 other men were already there. Samuel Graves from the claim north of Adelaide's and old Marcus Pine, who'd homesteaded the valley before most current residents were born. Both had noticed Adelaide's survival, done their own mathematics, reached the same impossible conclusion. Adelaide stood in her barn, pitchfork in hand, looking at 3 desperate men who'd spent weeks watching for her failure and now wanted her help. "One at a time. I'll explain what I did, but I won't repeat it 20 times. You'll have to teach each other." Over the next 7 days, 11 families sent representatives to see the underground room. Adelaide established a pattern, show the space, explain the principles, answer technical questions, and refused to claim expertise she didn't possess. The visitors always asked the same things: depth insulation method, ventilation strategy, cost in materials and labor. She gave honest answers. 8 feet to bedrock. Limestone for thermal mass. 3 separate air pathways. $12 in purchased materials. Everything else salvaged or quarried. 3 months of work, mostly solo except for the heavy timber. Some descended the ladder skeptical and emerged converted. Others needed to touch the warm walls themselves, verify the thermometer readings, stand in impossible comfort while winter raged overhead. A few brought their own instruments, unwilling to trust Adelaide's measurements. The numbers never changed. 55 to 60 degrees with an active fire. 48 to 52 overnight. Consistent, reliable physics doing what physics did regardless of who observed it. The pattern of visitors revealed the valley's social fault lines. Wealthy families sent hired men to investigate maintaining distance while gathering intelligence. Working homesteaders came themselves, sometimes bringing wives or older children. The poorest waited longest, trapped between pride and desperation, needing the solution, but unable to admit need without surrendering dignity they'd already mortgaged too heavily. Daniel Wright arrived on January 21st, announced by the sound of his wagon wheels breaking through crusted snow. Adelaide was feeding the chickens when he dismounted, his face carrying that particular set to the jaw that preceded difficult admissions. "I heard from 3 separate sources about your success during the storm, numbers that seemed impossible." "Numbers are just measurements. They don't care about seeming." Wright pulled a leather-bound notebook from his coat. "I'd like permission to inspect the structure again, properly this time with instruments. Document what you've achieved here." Adelaide led him to the trap door without comment. He descended with the methodical precision of someone approaching a structure he'd predicted would fail, needing to understand why it hadn't. For 90 minutes he measured, tested, sketched. He brought a plumb line, a carpenter's level metal probes to check for settling. He lit smoke bombs to trace ventilation flow. He examined every joint, every beam placement, looking for the flaw that would explain eventual collapse. He found nothing. The structure was sound. More than sound, it was elegant in its simplicity, using basic materials to solve a complex problem through pure application of principle. The engineering was crude by Philadelphia standards, but the physics were unassailable. When he climbed back up, he found an audience. News of Wright's visit had spread, and half a dozen men had gathered to hear the valley's certified expert render judgment on the widow Thornwell's madness. Wright stood at the barn's entrance, everyone waiting for his verdict. When he spoke, his voice carried to the back of the small crowd. "I was wrong. She was right. The structure is sound, the method effective, and the results speak for themselves." He turned to Adelaide. "Would you object to me using this design in a boarding house project I'm planning for Helena?" The gathered men processed this information in visible stages. Daniel Wright, trained carpenter possessor of actual credentials, had just publicly admitted error and asked permission to copy from a widow with no formal education who'd built something he'd declared dangerous. The social order had just inverted, and everyone present knew it. Adelaide met Wright's eyes with the same level calm she'd maintained through 3 months of mockery. "The principles aren't mine to keep. Use them however they help." Wright nodded, made notes in his book, and left. The men who'd gathered dispersed slowly, talking among themselves in voices that had lost their certainty. Adelaide went back to her chickens, aware that something fundamental had shifted, but too tired to analyze what it meant beyond immediate survival. Constance Whitmore arrived 2 days later alone, which was remarkable enough to draw Rosalind's immediate attention. "Mama, Mrs. Whitmore's coming up the path." Adelaide finished the seam she was mending before looking up. Through the window she could see Constance picking her way through snow in expensive boots poorly suited to frontier conditions, her face set in lines that suggested this visit cost considerable pride. She knocked. Adelaide opened the door. Neither woman spoke immediately. "May I see it?" Constance's voice had lost its usual commanding certainty. "What you built?" Adelaide considered refusing payment for months of judgment for the guardianship threat for every public comment about proper standards. But refusing would be vindication Constance didn't deserve to feel. Better to let the room itself deliver the verdict. "Follow me." They walked to the barn in silence. Adelaide moved the feed sacks, opened the trap door, descended. Constance followed her expensive skirts, whispering against the ladder rungs. At the bottom, she stopped, absorbing the space in one comprehensive scan. The temperature registered first immediate, undeniable warmth after the brutal cold outside. Then the construction stone walls, solid as any building she'd seen, ceiling that didn't sag or creak, ventilation shafts precisely placed. The beds made neatly, the stove cold but clearly functional, the oil lamp providing steady light. Nothing improvised, nothing desperate. Just a room that solved a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. Constance walked the perimeter, touched the limestone walls, looked up at the barn floor overhead. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge. "The limestone from the creek bed. Would that work for this?" Not an apology, not acknowledgement of the guardianship threat or the months of public judgment. Just a question about materials asked by someone who'd burned her dining table and still frozen. "That's what I used." Constance nodded slowly. "How deep did you dig before hitting bedrock?" Adelaide walked her through the technical details, the same information she'd given 11 other families, aware that something about this conversation mattered beyond mere construction advice. Constance was capitulating without admitting defeat, seeking help without confessing need. It was as close to an apology as her pride would permit. When they climbed back up, Constance paused at the barn door. "Your daughters look healthy. They sleep warm. Warm children tend toward health." "Yes, I imagine they do." Constance adjusted her shawl. "Thank you for showing me." She walked back toward her own property, and Adelaide knew she'd just witnessed something rarer than efficient heating, a woman of means confronting the possibility that wealth couldn't insulate against every problem, that sometimes solutions came from people she'd dismissed as incompetent. Reverend Morrison returned the following Sunday, after services, his approach more tentative than his previous visit. Adelaide received him in the cabin, Rosalind and Beatrice present this time instead of hidden. "Mrs. Thornwell, I owe you an explanation. The church council met yesterday. Given the success of your innovation, and the testimony from families who've examined the structure, we've concluded that no intervention is necessary." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "We may have been too quick to question your judgment. You were protecting children based on information you had. I don't fault caution." Morrison looked relieved at this measured response, though whether relief came from avoiding confrontation or from permission to avoid deeper apology remained unclear. "There's been talk among some families about attempting similar construction. I wanted to ask, do you have concerns about others using your method?" "My concern is that children survive winter. How many rooms that takes isn't my business." The Reverend nodded, made a few more polite noises about community and providence, and left. Adelaide recognized the visit for what it was: official sanction, after the fact, the church aligning itself with proven success rather than uncertain innovation. She felt no triumph in it. Approval that arrived only after results were undeniable wasn't worth the energy resentment required. By February, Thomas Fletcher had begun excavation under his chicken coop. Smaller scale than Adelaide's 8 feet by 8 rather than 10 by 12, but using the same principles. He came by twice for advice, once about ventilation angles, once about whether sandstone from his property would work as well as limestone. Should hold heat longer, actually. Denser stone, more thermal mass per cubic foot. Fletcher filed this information away with visible satisfaction. His wife Mary visited separately, brought Adelaide a loaf of fresh bread, and stood in the underground room with tears running down her face at the thought of her children sleeping in this kind of warmth next winter. The Pritchards started their version in March under the hay barn where they stored feed for their dairy operation. They went deeper than Adelaide had, 10 feet instead of 8, and discovered that the extra depth provided even more stable temperatures. Their project was more ambitious too. They partitioned the space, dedicating half to sleeping quarters and half to root vegetable storage, solving 2 problems with 1 excavation. By April 7, families were actively building. By summer, that number had reached 11. Each adapted the basic design to their specific circumstances. The Crawfords, who had 6 children, built a larger space with sleeping platforms instead of individual beds. The Mortons combined their underground room with an existing root cellar, creating an integrated system accessed through the cabin itself. Young couple named Harrison, newly married and desperately poor, dug by moonlight to hide their poverty from neighbors while creating the warmth they couldn't afford through conventional means. Adelaide became an unofficial consultant, answering questions, offering suggestions, occasionally showing up at a construction site to point out a ventilation error or structural concern. She never charged for this assistance, viewing it as part of the same survival collective that saw neighbors help with harvests and barn raisings. Information wanted to spread. Problems wanted solving. Withholding knowledge that could prevent suffering felt like a violation of something more fundamental than property rights. The variations taught her things she hadn't known. The Pritchards' discovery about sandstone thermal retention. The Crawfords' success with sleeping platforms that maximized floor space. The Mortons' integration with existing structures that reduced construction time by half. Each family contributed to a growing body of practical knowledge that belonged to everyone and no one, refined through trial and collective observation. Summer turned to fall. Adelaide maintained her own routine, laying in winter supplies, preserving food, preparing for the test that would arrive when temperature dropped again. The valley watched with interest now, rather than judgment, wondering if the method would prove reliable across multiple years, or if the previous winter had been anomaly rather than pattern. November brought early cold again, and the families with completed underground rooms descended into their spaces with varying degrees of confidence. Fletcher's family moved into their 8 by 8 room on November 12th. The Pritchards, the Crawfords, the Harrisons all retreated below ground as Montana winter arrived with its usual indifference to human preparation. Adelaide burned her usual 8 to 10 logs daily, maintained her usual 55 to 60 degrees. Rosalind and Beatrice continued their schoolwork by lamplight, played quiet games, read books. The routine had become normal now, the initial strangeness worn away by months of practice. Above ground, families in traditional cabins still struggled, still burned 30 to 40 logs daily, still woke to frozen walls and children who coughed through the night. But now they did so with the knowledge that alternatives existed, that their suffering was choice rather than inevitability. Some couldn't afford construction materials. Some lacked physical capacity to dig. Some simply refused to abandon tradition for innovation. But the choice had become visible, and visibility changed everything. The second winter proved what the first had suggested: reliability. Fletcher's family burned 12 to 15 logs daily in their smaller space, maintained comfortable temperatures, slept uninterrupted through the night. The Pritchards discovered their deeper excavation meant they could let their fire die completely overnight without temperature dropping below 48 degrees. The Crawfords housed 6 children in relative comfort on fuel consumption that would have frozen them in their previous cabin. By Christmas 1888, the term barn quarters had entered local vocabulary without irony. What had been scandalous in January had become practical by summer and normalized by year's end. Not everyone used the method. Tradition and pride and simple inertia kept many families in their freezing cabins, but its legitimacy was no longer questioned. January brought another storm, less severe than the previous year but still brutal. Adelaide weathered it with the same efficiency that had shocked Thomas Fletcher 12 months earlier. Across the valley, families with underground rooms maintained comfort, while those in conventional structures burned through February's wood allocation by mid-month. The economic reality became impossible to ignore. A family spending $12 on materials and 3 months of labor could reduce their winter fuel costs by 70%. Over a decade, that was the difference between marginal survival and actual security. The calculations spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. Build once, save forever. Suffer briefly, benefit permanently. Spring 1889 brought 14 completed underground winter quarters within the valley's 12-mile radius. Variations had proliferated: different depths, different stone types, different integration points with existing structures. But the core principles remained constant: thermal mass, earth insulation, strategic use of rising heat. The method was simple enough that anyone could attempt it, robust enough that crude execution still produced functional results. Daniel Wright completed his Helena boarding house project that summer. 6 underground sleeping rooms arranged around a central masonry core, each one maintaining 60-degree temperatures with minimal fuel. He mentioned Adelaide's design in his professional notes, though didn't publicize her name. Word spread anyway, the way useful information always did on the frontier, carried by travelers and correspondents, and the simple reality that people talked about solutions that worked. The territorial newspaper picked up the story in March, sending a reporter who spent 2 hours in Adelaide's underground room examining the structure and interviewing its creator. The resulting article got details wrong, attributed the idea to her deceased husband, misunderstood the ventilation system, exaggerated the construction difficulty, but captured the essential truth: widow's innovation proves warmer than convention. The headline amused Adelaide more than it annoyed her. Convention had never kept anyone warm. Physics didn't care about headlines. The room worked because stone held heat and earth provided insulation, and warmth rose toward cold principles that had existed since matter condensed from void. She'd just paid attention to what was already true. By 1890, 23 homesteads within 20 miles had some variation of underground winter quarters. The designs had diverged based on available materials and specific needs. Creek limestone in the western valley, sandstone from quarries to the north, river rock in the south, less effective but cheaper. Adobe in territories where stone was scarce, the principle proving adaptable across different geological contexts. The technique reached the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office, which published a brief pamphlet in spring 1893, Earth-Sheltered Winter Quarters, Observations from Montana Homesteads. The document included rough diagrams, material lists, and a 2-paragraph case study about a widowed homesteader near 16 Mile Creek who'd reduced winter fuel consumption by 70%. Adelaide's name appeared nowhere in the text, which was probably how she preferred it. 3 more boarding houses in Montana Territory incorporated similar systems by 1892. The practice spread to Wyoming, Idaho, anywhere winters were brutal and fuel expensive, and people desperate enough to try something different. Each region adapted the core method to local conditions, creating variations that improved on Adelaide's original design while maintaining her fundamental insights. Constance Whitmore built a small underground room beneath her workshop in fall 1889. She never mentioned Adelaide when describing it to others, calling it a winter storage area that happens to stay warm. Adelaide heard about this through Rosalind, who heard it from Constance's daughter, who'd mentioned it at school. The information arrived stripped of context, but rich in implication. Even wealth and pride had limits when confronting Montana cold. The cultural shift was quieter than revolution, but deeper than fashion. What had been undignified in 1887 became practical by 1889 and unremarkable by 1891. No one apologized. No one admitted they'd been wrong about Adelaide specifically. They just quietly adopted her method and pretended they'd never questioned it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Adelaide watched this transformation with something between amusement and satisfaction. She'd never needed credit, just results. Her daughters slept warm. Other children slept warm. The valley had learned that survival sometimes required abandoning convention for physics. Whether anyone thanked her mattered less than whether they stopped freezing. By mid-1890s, barn quarters appeared in territorial building codes not as requirement but as recognized option, legitimate alternative to conventional structure. The shift from scandal to standard had taken less than 5 years, which felt simultaneously too fast and too slow. Too fast because social change usually ground forward like glaciers. Too slow because children had frozen while adults debated propriety. The boarding house successes brought professional legitimacy. When trained carpenters like Daniel Wright incorporated the method into commercial projects, it validated what frontier experience had already proven. Architecture academies began teaching earth-sheltered design as option for extreme climates. The knowledge that had started with a desperate widow noticing her barn was warmer than her cabin became part of formal engineering curriculum. Adelaide's daughters grew. Rosalind turned 16 in 1892, competent and practical, her mother's approach to problem-solving visible in how she handled everything from arithmetic to social navigation. Beatrice, now 12, showed no trace of the chronic cough that had terrified Adelaide 4 winters earlier. Both girls took for granted what their mother had fought to create, the assumption that winter was manageable rather than merely survivable. Sometimes watching them study by lamplight in the underground room, Adelaide felt the weight of what she'd almost lost. If Constance's guardianship petition had succeeded, if the church council had decided intervention was necessary, if she'd listened to the voices insisting her plan was dangerous, undignified, doomed, her daughters would have been taken dispersed to families who could provide proper care, which apparently meant freezing in cabins heated by desperation and burning furniture. The valley had been wrong about many things, but it had been most wrong about what constituted safety. Safety wasn't propriety or convention or meeting others' expectations. Safety was structural integrity and reliable warmth and children who slept through the night without coughing blood. Everything else was decoration. Winter 1894 brought the coldest temperatures on record. -42 degrees on February 8th, sustained for 3 days. Adelaide's underground room maintained 54 degrees with 12 logs daily. The Fletchers, the Pritchards, all the families who'd built their own versions warm. Families in traditional cabins desperate. By this point the pattern was so established that no one even remarked on it. Physics had won the argument so thoroughly that arguing seemed pointless. Spring thaw brought Silas Merrick to Adelaide's property one final time. The old carpenter was 74, now moving slower but still sharp-eyed. He descended into the underground room, touched the limestone walls that had held steady for 7 winters, examined joints that hadn't shifted even fractionally. Joseph would be proud. You finished what he started, did it better than he probably could have. Adelaide shook her head. He gave me the principle. I just applied it. Application's the hard part. Ideas are cheap. Building them when everyone says you're crazy, that's where most people fail. He climbed back up the ladder, paused at the top. You changed how this valley thinks about winter. That's worth more than they'll probably ever tell you. After he left, Adelaide stood in the space that had cost her 3 months of brutal labor and years of social judgment, running her hand along stone that still radiated faint warmth from yesterday's fire. The room had saved her daughters' lives, probably saved others' children too, though she'd never know the exact count. That seemed like adequate compensation for mockery and threats and being called mad. The frontier rewarded results, not rhetoric. It rewarded function over form, and it rewarded stubborn refusal to freeze when alternatives existed, even if those alternatives required digging into darkness and trusting physics over people. Adelaide had understood that from the beginning, back when understanding it meant choosing between dignity and survival. She'd chosen survival and built the dignity afterward out of stone and earth, and the simple truth that warmth beats correctness every single time. Above ground. Montana, winter still raged with the same indifference it had shown for millennia. Below ground, in rooms scattered across the valley, families slept in defiance of that indifference, proving that human ingenuity could create pockets of comfort in the midst of cosmic cold. Not by fighting winter, but by understanding it well enough to step sideways from its worst effects. That understanding, more than any individual structure, was Adelaide Thornwell's legacy. Not buildings, but the permission to question whether suffering was actually inevitable or just habitual. The courage to try something different when different meant survival. The willingness to be called crazy while proving sane, to sacrifice reputation while building something that mattered more than opinion. By 1895, no one called it crazy anymore. They called it practical, sensible, obvious in retrospect. The social amnesia was complete. Everyone had always known this worked. Everyone had always supported it. Everyone forgot the years of mockery and judgment. Adelaide let them forget. Memory didn't heat rooms. Physics did. And physics blessedly didn't require acknowledgement to function. The 1890s settled into rhythm. Adelaide descended the ladder each November, lit the first fire of winter, and watched her daughters arrange their beds in a space that no longer felt experimental. Routine had replaced wonder. The limestone walls darkened from years of smoke, the ladder rungs wore smooth from countless climbs, and the underground room became simply where the Thornwell family slept when snow covered Montana. Rosalind turned 16 in autumn 1892, tall and capable in ways that reminded Adelaide of herself. Before widowhood had compressed all potential into survival. The girl had helped 3 families that summer with their own underground construction projects: the Hendersons, who were struggling with ventilation calculations, the McCormick family trying to adapt the design for their particular soil composition, and a newly arrived Swedish couple named Lindstrom, who spoke limited English but understood thermal mass when Rosalind sketched the principles in their barn dirt. Adelaide never charged for this assistance, though families offered payment in forms ranging from cash to labor to preserved goods. The refusal wasn't martyrdom or false modesty. The knowledge simply didn't belong to her in any meaningful sense. Joseph had planted the seed observation about earth temperature. Silas Merrick had contributed structural expertise. The Valley's collective trial and error had refined details she'd gotten wrong initially. Claiming ownership over accumulated wisdom felt like trying to patent mathematics. "Mama, the Lindstroms want to pay you in silver. Mrs. Lindstrom is insisting." Adelaide looked up from the butter churn. "Tell her the best payment is her children sleeping warm. That's worth more than silver." Rosalind delivered this message, came back shaking her head. "She says in the old country knowledge has price. Here it should too. Here we share what helps us survive. That's the price you pass it on when someone else needs it." The girl absorbed this lesson the way she absorbed everything her mother taught, adding it to an internal framework Adelaide hoped would serve her better than formal schooling ever could. Practical wisdom, the kind that kept people alive when theories failed. Beatrice at 12 showed no shadow of the sickness that had terrified Adelaide 5 winters back. The chronic cough had vanished completely by their second year underground, her lungs strengthening in stable warmth the way lungs couldn't when subjected to nightly freezing. She'd grown sturdy, pink-cheeked, the kind of healthy that came from sleeping in temperatures that didn't require the body to burn its own reserves, just maintaining core heat through darkness. The girl had taken to drawing lately, sketching the underground room from memory during school hours, bringing the pictures home to show Adelaide. In Beatrice's renderings, the limestone walls looked almost elegant, the space cozy rather than crude. Children processed reality differently than adults. What Adelaide saw as desperate solution, Beatrice experienced as home. Winter, 1893, passed like the five before it, cold above comfort, below the pattern so established that Adelaide sometimes forgot how strange it had seemed initially. She burned her 8 to 12 logs daily, maintained her 55 to 60 degrees, lived in defiance of Montana winter without needing to announce the defiance. Physics did the announcing. Every morning she woke rested rather than exhausted, was a small rebellion against the assumption that survival required suffering. Spring brought letters, first from Daniel Wright in Helena, detailing his third boarding house project incorporating underground sleeping quarters, asking permission to mention her by name in an article he was writing for a territorial construction journal. Adelaide wrote back, "Mention the method, not the person." What mattered was that people stayed warm, not who first showed them how. The second letter came from the Agricultural Extension Office in Butte, requesting detailed diagrams and material specifications for their winter housing guidance publication. Adelaide spent a week producing careful sketches, depth measurements, stone thickness, ventilation angles, timber load calculations. She mailed them without expecting acknowledgement, which proved accurate. The pamphlet appeared 6 months later with her diagrams redrawn by someone with formal training, her name absent from every page. The information reached people who needed it. That was sufficient. Rosalind started courting that year. Owen Blackwell, whose family ran a cattle operation 2 valleys over, began appearing at Sunday services with suspicious regularity, given his family attended a different church. He was polite, hard-working, clearly terrified of Adelaide in the way young men got when approaching the mother of a girl they admired. Adelaide watched this development with mixed feelings: pride that Rosalind had attracted someone decent, sorrow that her daughter's childhood was ending, practical concern about whether Owen understood what marrying into the Thornwell family actually meant. She needn't have worried. Owen's first serious conversation with Adelaide happened in the underground room. Rosalind had brought him to see it, and he stood in the center of the space with an expression Adelaide recognized someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about possible. "My family's been burning 40 logs a day, keeping our main house barely above freezing. You're telling me this works on 8 to 12? Works on physics. Logs are just the fuel for getting physics started." Owen walked. The perimeter touched the walls, examined the ventilation shafts with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered in ways that killed people when ignored. When he finished his inspection, he turned to Rosalind rather than Adelaide. "If we married, would you help me build something like this on our property?" Rosalind's face colored, but her voice stayed steady. "I'd help you understand why it works so you could build it yourself." Owen nodded, satisfied. Adelaide recognized the moment for what it was, a young man making sure the woman he wanted to marry came with practical skills rather than just decorative qualities. Smart choice. Winters didn't care about decoration. The wedding happened June 1898. Small ceremony, practical celebration, no pretense that frontier life allowed for elaborate excess. Owen and Rosalind left for their own homestead immediately after carrying Adelaide's sketches and Silas Merrick's carpentry advice and the accumulated knowledge of 11 years of underground winter quarters. They broke ground on their own version in July. Adelaide watched her daughter disappear into adult life with the particular ache mothers feel when competence makes children obsolete as children. Rosalind didn't need her anymore, not the way she had at 12 when every decision required maternal guidance. The girl had internalized the lessons: trust physics, question convention, build for results rather than appearances. Whatever came next, she'd handle it. Beatrice filled the space. Rosalind's absence created growing into adolescence with the kind of quiet determination that reminded Adelaide of Joseph. The girl announced at 14 that she wanted to teach, specifically to teach in places where children didn't have access to formal education. Adelaide listened to this ambition and saw her own pragmatism reflected. Education wasn't about status or refinement, It was about giving people tools to solve the problems their lives would inevitably present. Teaching doesn't pay well. Neither does farming. You still did it. The logic was unassailable. Adelaide helped Beatrice prepare for the teacher certification exam, drilling her on arithmetic and grammar and geography subjects Adelaide herself had learned haphazardly. The girl passed on her first attempt, remarkable for someone who'd spent winters in a hole beneath a barn rather than attending formal boarding school. By 1900, Beatrice was teaching in Helena, living in one of Daniel Wright's boarding houses with the underground sleeping quarters Wright had copied from Adelaide's design. The circularity pleased Adelaide more than she admitted. Her daughter sleeping warm in a room inspired by the one Adelaide built to save her life. Knowledge propagating through generations, solving the same problem in different contexts. Adelaide was 45 years old. Her daughters launched into their own lives, the homestead feeling larger and emptier without the steady presence of children needing her. She continued her routine farm work in growing seasons underground, room in winter, the cycle as predictable as Montana weather patterns. Other families still consulted her occasionally about construction problems or adaptations, but the knowledge had dispersed so thoroughly that she was no longer essential to its spread. The method had achieved self-sufficiency. Silas Merrick died in his sleep, November 1903, age 77. Adelaide attended the funeral and stood among men half his age who'd learned carpentry from him, who'd built their houses and barns under his guidance. The Reverend spoke about craftsmanship and legacy, about how a man's work outlasted his breathing. Adelaide thought about the underground room, about Silas's patient teaching, while she'd struggled with beam placement, about his refusal to let social judgment interfere with structural soundness. His hands had shaped her survival as surely as her own. Winter 1903 was her last. The influenza arrived in February, sweeping through the valley with the kind of democratic indifference. Diseases showed wealth and poverty, young and old, conventional and innovative, all equally vulnerable. Adelaide felt the fever building on a Tuesday, recognized it for what it was by Wednesday evening, knew by Thursday morning that her body wouldn't win this fight. Beatrice came immediately when the neighbor brought word. Rosalind arrived the next day, bringing Owen and their infant son. They gathered in the cabin. Not the underground room. Adelaide was too weak to manage the latter, and she looked at her daughters' faces and saw competent adults rather than the shivering children she'd carried below ground 16 winters earlier. Her mind drifted, fever breaking down the barriers between memory and present. She saw Joseph standing at the barn door explaining about earth temperature with the patient certainty of someone who understood principles without needing formal education. She felt the shovel in her hands, the endless repetition of digging the way her back had screamed and her resolve had held. She heard Constance Whitmore's voice condemning her choices, heard Daniel Wright warning about structural failure, heard all the people who'd been so certain she was wrong and so shocked when physics refused to care about their certainty. Beatrice held her hand. "Mama, is there anything you want us to know? Anything you didn't tell us?" Adelaide's throat was dry, words coming with effort. "Your father, Joseph, he told me Earth was warmer than air. I just trusted him enough to prove it. That's all I did. Trusted someone who understood something I didn't." Rosalind leaned closer. "You did more than trust. You built. Because you were cold. Children shouldn't be cold. Physics doesn't care who applies it, just that someone does." The words came slower now, fever pulling her toward darkness. "Pass it on. Not for credit, just so people stop freezing when they don't have to." She died that evening, February 18, 1904, age 49. Not from cold, not from structural collapse, not from any of the dangers people had predicted when she'd begun digging beneath her barn. Just from disease, the thing that killed people regardless of how cleverly they solved heating problems. They buried her next to Joseph in the small valley cemetery, his grave marked by simple limestone she'd pulled from the same creek bed that provided her walls. The Reverend spoke about perseverance and maternal devotion, about a woman who'd faced impossible odds and created possibility. He didn't mention the underground room specifically, which by 1904 was so normalized that pointing it out would have seemed strange, like praising someone for understanding that fire was hot. Rosalind and Beatrice returned to the homestead after the funeral, descended into the underground room one final time together. The space was exactly as Adelaide had left it, beds made stove cold, the limestone walls still solid after 17 winters of expansion and contraction. They stood in the warmth that wasn't warmth anymore, just stable temperature, maintained by principles their mother had trusted when no one else would. "We should keep it." Rosalind's voice carried the weight of decision made. "When the property sells, specify that the room stays intact." Beatrice nodded. "Someone will use it. Maybe not us, but someone." They were right. The homestead sold within 6 months to a family named Patterson, who needed the land more than they questioned the eccentric infrastructure. The Pattersons used the underground room every winter for the next 15 years, burning their modest fuel allocation and sleeping in comfort their neighbors couldn't match. They appreciated the space without knowing its history, which felt appropriate. Solutions didn't require origin stories to remain solutions. By 1920, the valley had changed. Improved roads meant easier fuel transport. Better cabin construction meant less heat loss. Newer families arriving from the east brought different assumptions about winter management. The underground rooms remained functional, but no longer necessary in the way they'd been when Adelaide first dug beneath her barn. Progress in one area had made innovation in another area less critical. The Patterson barn collapsed in a spring storm, 1923. Age and weather had weakened the structure beyond economical repair. The family hired contractors to build a replacement 20 feet north of the original location, modern design with proper foundation, and purchased lumber. During demolition, workers discovered the underground room preserved perfectly beneath the wreckage. The foreman stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at limestone walls that showed no cracks despite 3.5 decades of Montana temperature swings. The ventilation shafts were still clear. The ceiling beams hadn't sagged a fraction of an inch. Whoever had built this had understood structural principles at a level that made his own training look superficial. Should we fill it in? Pour concrete, level the whole thing? The property owner, Patterson's son, who'd grown up sleeping in that room every winter, shook his head. "Leave it. We'll use it for potato storage. Temperature stays perfect year-round." So the room survived, repurposed but intact, serving a different function than Adelaide had intended, but still operating on the same physics. 50 degrees in summer, 50 degrees in winter, reliable as gravity. The potatoes stored there lasted months longer than those kept in conventional cellars, proving yet again that earth insulation worked regardless of what you were insulating. Decades passed. The Pattersons sold to the Kowalskis in 1947. The Kowalskis sold to the Hendersons in 1968. Each family used the underground room without questioning its existence, accepting it as feature rather than anomaly. Barns had rooms beneath them sometimes. This one did. The potatoes stayed fresh. Nobody needed more explanation than that. The Historical Society survey happened almost by accident. Summer 1974. A graduate student named Margaret Chen conducting research on frontier homesteading patterns for her thesis on Montana territorial development. She was examining property records in the county archive when she found Adelaide Thornwell's name on a deed from 1886, noted the succession of owners traced the property to its current location. The Hendersons were polite but confused when she showed up asking about 19th century construction. As far as they knew, the barn was from the 1920s, the house from the 1930s. Nothing on the property dated to territorial days. What about underground structures, root cellars, storage spaces? Mr. Henderson's expression shifted to recognition. "There's an old room under where the original barn used to be. We use it for vegetables. You're welcome to look, but it's just a hole with stone walls. Nothing special." Margaret followed him to the modern barn, watched him move aside crates of equipment, open a trap door she'd assumed was for accessing foundation infrastructure. She descended into darkness that smelled of earth and old stone, clicked on her flashlight, and found herself standing in architecture that predated every assumption she'd made about frontier building techniques. The walls were coursed limestone, dry-stacked, and mud-mortared at least 18 inches thick. The ceiling consisted of hand-hewn timber beams notched directly into bedrock, supporting planks that bore the weight of the structure above without visible stress. Ventilation shafts rose at precise angles, positioned to create passive airflow even without mechanical assistance. In the corner, blackened stone marked where a stove had stood, the placement calculated for optimal heat distribution. She spent 3 hours measuring, photographing, sketching. The technical sophistication shocked her. This wasn't crude frontier improvisation. This was engineered space built by someone who understood thermodynamics, load distribution, and environmental systems integration at a level most contemporary architects couldn't match. "Do you know who built this?" Henderson shrugged. "Been here longer than anyone remembers. Pattersons might have known, but the last one died in '69. Margaret returned to the archives, cross-referencing property records with census data, birth certificates, death records. Adelaide Thornwell emerged in fragments, widowed 1885, died 1904, 2 daughters surviving. A brief notation in the 1889 territorial newspaper archive, "Widow's winter quarters prove warmer than convention." Nothing else. No detailed plans, no engineering specifications, no explanation for how an uneducated widow in 1887 had built something that still functioned flawlessly 87 years later. She wrote her report carefully, academically, stripping away the emotional resonance to focus on technical details. Structure demonstrates unusual but effective approach to thermal regulation in extreme climates. Limestone walls provide thermal mass estimated at 4,000 pounds, capable of storing and releasing heat across 10 to 12-hour cycles. Earth insulation on 3 sides maintains stable temperature, estimated 50 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. Ceiling structure transfers load to bedrock, preventing settling, common in earthen construction. Recommend preservation as example of vernacular architecture solving complex problems through empirical observation rather than formal training. The report went into Montana State Archives, filed under Frontier Building Techniques Miscellaneous. No historical marker was erected, no preservation order issued. The room was simply documented, cataloged, and forgotten by everyone except potato farmers who appreciated consistent storage temperatures. The world turned. Technology advanced. Home heating became matter of thermostats and forced air and fuel delivered by truck rather than split by hand. The knowledge Adelaide had fought to prove became obsolete in the way that candles became obsolete after electricity, not wrong but unnecessary. By 2024, the property had changed hands 3 more times. The current owners, a couple named Rodriguez who'd moved from California seeking affordable acreage, used the underground room exactly as the Hendersons had, storing root vegetables and preserved goods in space that maintained perfect temperature without electricity or mechanical refrigeration. They knew it was old, probably from the 1920s, based on the barn that used to stand above it maybe earlier. Nobody had told them the actual history. Nobody was left who knew. Mrs. Rodriguez descended the ladder on a January morning when the surface temperature read -22 degrees, pulling aside the modern plastic bins to access the potatoes stored in the room's far corner. The limestone walls felt cool to her touch, stable and unchanging. The temperature was probably 48-50 degrees. She didn't measure it scientifically, just knew from experience that things stayed fresh down here in ways they didn't in the heated house. She filled her basket, climbed back up. Never thought about the woman who dug this space one shovel load at a time while her daughters froze above ground. Never wondered about the social judgment that widow had faced, the warnings about danger, the mockery that had preceded vindication. The room simply existed, functional and unremarkable, solving the same problem in 2024 it had solved in 1887. Physics didn't age. Stone still held heat. Earth still insulated. The principles Adelaide Thornwell had trusted when trust meant choosing survival over dignity remained as reliable as they'd been when Montana was territory rather than state. The room she'd built existed in defiance of time the same way it had existed in defiance of convention, quietly, effectively, without requiring anyone's acknowledgement to continue working. If you stood in that space today, descended the ladder, and let your eyes adjust to darkness, you'd find nothing remarkable. Just limestone walls hand-split from creek bed stone, just timber beams notched into bedrock, just a dirt floor packed hard as concrete from a century and a half of footsteps. Just physics doing what physics does, holding temperature steady while the world above swings between extremes. No plaque explains what happened here. No museum exhibit preserves the story. The only memorial is the structure itself, still dry, still solid, still maintaining its 50-degree equilibrium, while Montana winter demonstrates the same indifference it showed in 1887. That seems fitting. Adelaide Thornwell never wanted recognition. She wanted her children warm. The room accomplished that, then kept accomplishing it for everyone who came after, which is the only legacy that survives solutions that work long after the people who created them have turned to dust. Somewhere in the Montana State Archives, Margaret Chen's 1974 report sits in a filing box marked Territorial Architecture General. Her photographs show limestone walls that could have been built yesterday. Her measurements document precision that formal education supposedly conferred. Her conclusion acknowledges effectiveness without understanding the desperation that drove innovation. She got it half right. The structure was unusual but effective. What she missed was the human dimension. The widow watching her daughter cough blood. The community insisting suffering was inevitable. The choice between freezing with dignity or surviving with shame. The technical specifications captured how the room worked. They couldn't capture why it mattered or what it cost the woman who built it to prove that warmth was possible even when everyone said it wasn't. But maybe that's appropriate too. Adelaide wouldn't have wanted her story preserved if preservation meant focusing on struggle rather than solution. The room worked. Children slept warm. The physics proved reliable. Everything else, the judgment, the vindication, the slow cultural shift from mockery to acceptance, was just noise around the essential truth that heat rises and stone holds and earth insulates, regardless of who notices. That truth outlasted Adelaide Thornwell. It outlasted everyone who doubted her. It outlasted the social structures that declared her innovation undignified, the experts who warned of failure, the neighbors who thought she'd lost her mind. The underground room still exists, still functions, still proves every winter that sometimes wisdom looks like a woman with a shovel, refusing to accept the world's insistence that freezing is just what winter requires. The potatoes stored there taste no different than potatoes stored elsewhere. But they last longer, stay fresher, resist rot that temperature fluctuation causes. Small advantage, meaningless in the grand scheme. Except that accumulated small advantages are how people survive conditions designed to kill them. And survival. Adelaide understood from the first frozen morning she woke to her daughter's cough is the only revolution that matters when revolution means your children wake up breathing. 137 years after Adelaide Thornwell dug the first shovel load of Montana clay from beneath her barn floor, physics continues doing what physics does, indifferent to history, unimpressed by time. The limestone walls hold their heat. The earth maintains its insulation. The temperature stays steady while everything else changes. That steadiness, that absolute reliability of natural law when human systems fail, is what Adelaide trusted when she had nothing else to trust. She couldn't trust community judgment, couldn't trust conventional wisdom, couldn't trust that help would come or that mercy would save her daughters from cold that killed as surely as disease. But she could trust that warm air rises, that stone stores energy, that earth buried deep enough escapes winter's reach. She trusted physics and built accordingly, and the room she created still stands as testament to what happens when desperate people stop arguing with reality and start using it instead. Not a monument to genius, Adelaide would have rejected that characterization violently. Just a hole in the ground that keeps potatoes fresh and proves that sometimes the difference between freezing and survival is simply refusing to freeze when alternatives exist, even if those alternatives require digging toward warmth while everyone else insists you're digging your own grave. The woman who slept beneath the barn died more than a century ago. The barn itself collapsed generations back. But the room remains, and the physics remains, and the simple truth remains that winter doesn't care about convention, but yields completely to anyone who understands its rules well enough to step aside from its worst effects. That understanding passed through daughters who taught their own children dispersed through a valley that forgot its origin while remembering its application embedded in state archives as technical curiosity rather than human triumph. That's the legacy that persists. Not fame, not recognition, just the quiet continuation of solutions that worked then and work now and will work as long as stone holds heat and earth provides shelter and warmth matters more than the dignity of freezing in approved ways. Adelaide Thornwell built a bedroom under a barn. The bedroom became a valley full of bedrooms. The valley's bedrooms became a documented technique. The technique faded to obscurity while remaining functional. And through all those transformations, the core principle never changed: trust. Physics, question assumptions, and never accept suffering as inevitable when alternatives exist for anyone willing to dig deep enough to find them.